Where's the EQ on the reverb? Delay time? Delay. Turn up the feedback. Turn up the feedback. Turn up the feedback. Wait. Pan the condenser to the left and the dynamic to the right. Lower the threshold. Raise the output. Wait. Set the frequency range. Welcome to the show, everyone. My name is Clara, and I am the host of the Lady Audio podcast. Thank you for joining me today. And this week's shout-outs go to a few radio stations, and I just happened to be listening to a radio show today, my favorite radio show called The Barry and Dr. Colin Show, and you can find them on 10radio.org. They were just playing Octopus's Garden by the Beatles, so you can kind of understand why I like that show so much. Okay, so the shout-outs go to Strawberry Tongue Radio and Music Magazine. Strawberry Tongue has been around for over 15 years, playing post-punk, new wave, goth, dream pop, indie, alternative, and some experimental tracks as well. So all you have to do is visit strawberrytongue.com to tune in and to read the blog. And the second shout out goes to Primal Radio and the Primal Music Blog. Along the same genres as Strawberry Tongue, they offer hand-picked shoegaze, dream pop, post-rock, and post-punk. On the Primal Music Blog, you'll also find many reviews. And to listen to the radio station, just visit primalradiolive.com. And one thing to note, when you visit the radio station website, the music starts automatically. So I just thought I'd give you the heads up on that so you are prepared. And our final shout out goes to Banks Radio Australia. I'm just now getting into this radio station, and when you visit their website, the music starts automatically too. So another one that does that. And to find a show you might be interested in, just visit the calendar page. From there, you'll find all the listings and the different times. And of course, they're in Australia, so be aware of the time zone differences. And you will find the links to all these excellent indie radio stations in the show notes. And the last announcement I wanted to make is the Lady Audio podcast is brought to you by Maheekats. Maheekats run the Lady Audio business, and it consists of myself, Clara, and my husband, Craig. Together we offer audio editing and song mixing services. Lady Audio offers audio editing for podcasts, indie films, documentaries, short films, and stuff like that. And in regards to song mixing, we offer mixing for song demos, radio-ready songs, and compositions. And we can even play instruments on your track. This includes drums, bass, and guitar, played by Craig. He's an excellent drummer, by the way, and bass player and guitar player. He's really fast to pick up things, too. And if you need a female vocal, I can help with that, either myself, or I know other female vocalists who love to sing and have fabulous gear to get a professional sound. So thank you very much for visiting ladyaudio.com, and from there you can listen to the podcast and follow and share and donate and hire Lady Audio or Maheekats, and all that good stuff is all there on ladyaudio.com. And I'm not sure if you can hear her, but little Jackie is meowing in the background. Today's guest is Marc Henshall of the SoundMatters website and blog. Marc is a sound enthusiast, and his website offers very helpful advice, research, and resources, all related to keeping music sounding great. That means info for both the listener, or audiophile, and the creator, or sound engineer. Marc, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Clara, and thank you for having me on your lovely podcast.
You're welcome. Glad to have you. I wanted to start out with my first question here. I grew up I grew up listening to records in my room with my friends, and we'd sneak a beer or some smoke and just like trip out with the music. And it seems like that hasn't really changed. And a lot of kids are, hanging out in each other's rooms the same way, but they're using like YouTube and crappy speakers instead of like a nice record player with some speakers. What do you think about younger generations being attracted to vinyl? Do you think there's a market there? I mean, like, with the sale of a vinyl record, you have to have something to play it on. Like, you have to buy a record player, you have to buy a proper preamp and some speakers, and it seems like there's a viable market there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a lot of work, isn't it?
Yeah.
The whole thing, and it seems somewhat, I think, counterintuitive when you think about how much has changed in our behaviours as consumers over the years. And I think what you've said there in terms of listening behaviours really gets to the heart of the issue for me. And I think really we need to kind of almost take a step back to kind of understand what's going on. So, if you think back to previous decades, it's very much how sort of you and I remember consuming music, whether it be on vinyl or CD, some sort of physical medium, and kind of hanging out with your mates inside. I use mates. I'm from the UK, obviously, so there's a little bit of British slang coming out here. But hanging out with your buddies or your friends in your living room or your room, or hanging out listening to some nice music, and as you say, sneaking a beer or whatever and just chilling out. And really, although the core of the kind of hanging out side of it is still fundamentally the same, I think, for kids, the way that they do it and the medium that they consume on has fundamentally changed. And ultimately that has some severe kind of changes in terms of the importance of music. So I guess what I'm getting to is you look at every single generation, other than sort of the recent sort of 10 to 15 years, and every single generation, kind of from the 60s up through the 70s to the 80s and even the 90s, there's a clear definable kind of identity to kind of each decade and a music scene that was going on. And it's really clear that, music was at the core of popular culture through those decades, with the sort of British invasion stuff through the 60s, and then the kind of the glam era and the funk and disco kind of stuff through the 70s, and even punk. You think in the late 70s, and even moving into the 90s with things like the American grunge scene and the Britpop scene in the UK. It's quite clear that music was fundamental to the cultures of those decades, but something changes when we get into around about the sort of the turn of the millennium and the introduction of streaming or peer-to-peer sharing services like Napster. If anyone can, if anyone's sort of a certain age will remember the initial service of Napster. Now, that's going back a fair way, but that's kind of, I think, the beginning of people's habits beginning to change. And it's essentially, moving from a physical format of music, whether it be vinyl or CD, into the digital realm. And that ultimately leads to things like streaming. And as you quite rightly mentioned, things like YouTube, and something happens to our listening habit. So instead of the putting on an album and kind of listening from start to finish, we can now pick and choose and kind of skip at will, and consume music with much shorter attention spans, I feel. And so ultimately, I think that's had a huge impact on the kind of value of music. Ultimately, I genuinely don't believe the last 10 years or even what's going on now is as entrenched in our society as music was in the previous decades that I mentioned. I do believe that fickleness of our consumption has really changed the importance of music within our society. But, that might be across the board, but I do believe there are people who truly love music, and there always will be people who truly love music within any generation. that I think somehow are yearning for something a little bit more than just a digital file. They're yearning for kind of that music scene and that kind of consumption of music in a physical format that really demands your attention and is a joy to behold, that maybe their parents had, or maybe the generation that had beforehand. And there's people as well like me that I guess grew up with CD, and have ultimately discovered vinyl through partly through my parents and generation, and just as it's become more and more popular within popular culture, that resurgence of vinyl, have kind of gone towards, or have levitated towards vinyl, because I think as a musical as music in physical form, I think it's quite possibly the peak of music in physical form. When you look at things like the artwork, when you think about just the kind of the ritual and the process of putting vinyl on, I think ultimately, music in physical format, to me, and I think to a lot of people, really reaches its kind of peak in terms of it demanding your attention and it being interesting as an object in its own right. It kind of meets that peak at that point. So I think there's something behind that psychologically, I guess, just to kind of cut to the chase and get to my point. And it's interesting, I think, and this kind of really solidifies it for me, in that according to some recent studies, 72% of vinyl buyers are 35 and under. So to me, there's something going on there, in that it's not just a nostalgia trip from older people. There's genuinely a section of younger people who are not quite satisfied with just a digital file. Somehow they're looking for more than that. And I guess that gets to the heart of the issue for me.
Yeah, definitely. When I would go to some shows when I was living in Santa Barbara, whenever there was an artist playing, they would have CDs or nothing at all, or maybe just a little card they would give you to go and download. But I noticed that the more professional bands would have vinyl for sale on the side, along with their T-shirts and stuff like that. So I can definitely see how the younger generation would be open to that, because you get something,
Yeah, there's something a little bit more. There's something to take home. It's more than just the sound of the music. It's a souvenir. It's part of almost like belonging to a club. I think back in the day, you buy the T-shirts, you go to the gigs. It was an all-consuming scene. I guess going back to that thing that every decade seemed to have a scene, other than now where things are much more dispersed, and music, I think there's much more variety of styles within popular music, quite possibly, and the diversification of what people listen to has probably been a positive thing. But like you say, somehow that belonging to a kind of club in some way, and like you say, having something to take away kind of almost gives them that.
Right. Yep. And I wanted to touch base on this. It's kind of changing the subject here, and I'm not very good at segues and stuff, so my audience is just going to have to deal with it.
I gave you a mouthful there, I think, of kind of information. So it's cool.
Okay.
Let's get to the next point. Cool.
Sure. In your article, 5 things you need to get started with vinyl today, you don't mention speakers. What are your thoughts about speakers, and what type would you recommend to get started?
Sure. I think that's a great question, and you're quite right. It's not part of that kind of article. I think ultimately what it really comes down to me is that anything's better than sort of listening to music just on your laptop. So personally, I listen to music on any kind of speaker as much as I possibly can. I try to although I want to be kind of, just as a side note, clear here, is that there's absolutely no way I'm bashing digital or talking down digital consumption. If anything, I think that's been incredibly liberating for people in terms of the amount of exposure to music people have. But ultimately, I think just when the only way you consume music is on a laptop through tiny little speakers, I really feel personally you're missing out on the entire experience. So while you can spend as much money as you want on speakers, you can spend thousands of dollars on speakers, you can practically spend the the down payment on a house, if you really want to. But ultimately, I mean, most actual dedicated speakers are going to sound better than what's built into your laptop or what comes with your computer. I mean, personally, I live in quite a small. I don't know if you're aware of what houses are like in the UK, but they're significantly smaller than they are in the States, and so I've had to downsize my setup somewhat. I have a small hi-fi system, just a little denim one that I listen to vinyl records on. Nothing fancy, but it sounds better than listening through laptop speakers. And I previously had just for my kind of recording and production setup, I had a set of Tannoy speakers, which I really loved actually because they were really flat in sound and really sort of organic. But yeah, just to get to your point, I think really whatever your budget can afford, beyond the just basic laptop speaker stuff, is a good option. I know that it doesn't have to cost the earth. A company called Q Acoustics makes some really good sort of consumer hi-fi speakers that sound great in their price range. Won't break the bank. I mean, you're probably only talking about $150 or so for something that's that gets great reviews with the hi-fi kind of publications. If you're a recording artist at home, a lot of the studio reference speakers are great for that kind of thing. Stuff by people like the K range of speakers, for example, or the Tannoy stuff, as I've already mentioned. I mean, most of that, again, it's all good stuff, and it's all better than listening to music on laptop speakers. So that gets to the core of it for me.
Yeah, cool. And then you're talking about studio monitors. What's the difference between stereo speakers and studio monitors?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that comes up a lot in the kind of hi-fi world, is that confusion as to, well, I've seen these studio monitor speakers, are they appropriate for my hi-fi, and sort of vice versa. So really the core of it is that studio monitors are designed to be, flat reference speakers for essentially they're meant for referencing recordings and being as flat and true to the original sound as possible. So that obviously allows you to make much more accurate decision making in your mixing process. It allows you not to be it means that your mixes are going to translate much more accurately into the real world, and really I think they're also designed to be much more robust than typical consumer level hi-fi speakers, in that they're designed in that they know that you're going to be mixing music that's not compressed or mastered on there, and there's going to be those that large dynamic range in there, and highs and lows in terms of volume, and it needs to be robust enough to be able to take that kind of level of abuse. And to be quite frank, most consumer level stuff is just not expecting to meet that kind of wear and tear. So there's that aspect as well. I guess the final thing is just pure aesthetics. The consumer level speakers that you would buy are designed to be placed in a living room. Typically, that means that they're much more of the moment stylistically, or they're much more likely to blend into the decor of a room, for example. But again, I for a long time listened to used studio reference speakers as my main source of listening, because I personally like the really flat frequency response, because I like to hear the music as it was intended by the mixing engineer. I'm not one for boosting bass here or adding a little extra treble here and there in terms of EQ, in terms of the enjoyment and the playback in music. I like to enjoy it personally, for my personal taste, just how it was intended, and studio monitors are great for that.
Cool. Yeah, I agree too. I really like referencing when I'm mixing my own music with my husband. We'll always reference some other, mix that's kind of similar music. Or similar to that particular song, and we'll try to, what are they doing with that guitar? Where are the highs and the lows on that? And we have to use the studio monitors to be able to hear what the mixing engineer was doing on their mix. But listening to references is always, it's kind of weird in a way, because you're listening to something that has already been mastered and is commercially, consumed. And so when you're referencing your own mix, it's kind of like, well, I'm going to try to get as close to this as possible, but then when it reaches when it reaches the mastering stage, hopefully it'll, open up even further. And then, so I wanted to get into mastering a little bit here. I loved the title in your article about the loudness wars, where it says the biggest swindle in the music business, about remastered CDs. And I just wondered if you could please talk a little bit about your thoughts on remastered recordings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually it's really interesting that you just before I go into that, just what you mentioned about referencing tracks and everything. I think that's a fantastic approach, and it's really I think ultimately like listening to a track that you really like on as many systems as possible, and then also cross-referencing your own track on as many systems as possible is probably as you say, because you're listening to something that's already pre-done and mastered, it's not a fair comparison in many ways. But I guess I've totally done the same thing, and I find that approach ultimately is almost the best way to reference almost a real life situation. And so it's cool that it's interesting you mentioned that. So that's definitely something that I've been into doing myself. And anyway, to cut to your question, sure, yeah. I mean, remastered CDs, it's quite a dramatic headline, as you've pulled out to say that it's the biggest swindle. It sounds a little bit angry, and I guess there was some intent in terms of I do genuinely think it's cynical, and I do genuinely believe that it's ripping people off. And I think that the music industry has done this time and time again. Really, again, I think we need to take a step back. So the loudness war essentially is a sonic arms race. So, over the years, slowly, what they've realised, and this particularly came to a head through the 90s and again into the turn of the millennium. I guess the turn of the millennium has a lot to answer for in terms of our changing habits and the way we listen to music. Yeah. But I mean, ultimately, it's a sonic arms race in that they push the level as high as possible in order to, in their eyes, maintain a competitive edge with their music. So it kind of started really with radio. So one song would come on louder than the next, and the kind of psychology behind that would be that you'd stand up and you'd listen, you'd notice that track, but you'd also perceive the kind of louder track to be better and somehow more exciting. And in the beginning, there was really no problem with that. I mean, even going back to the Beatles, they really pushed the limits of what could be done with perceived volume in the mastering process. But where things really start to get bad is when we transition to the digital realm. And I'll try and give the short version of this because, to be quite frank, if you to ask some professional mastering engineers, I'm sure they give a better explanation of this. But the long and short of it is that in the digital realm, 0 dB is the limit. That's it. If you go beyond 0 dB, you're into the realm. You get clipping, audible distortion, and it sounds really, really nasty. So what they do in terms of the loudness war is they have slowly over the years imparted a process called brick wall limiting. So what that does is that you get essentially you take a limiter and you put it on the master bus, and you set. All a limiter is really is a compressor set to infinite ratio. So once it hits that wall, that point, it won't let the signal go beyond that point. So as you compress and you push everything up, you decrease the difference between that peak level and the lowest volume level within the signal. So you're slowly reducing that dynamic range. You're squashing everything, and you're at that. Through that process, you're raising the perceived volume of the track, so that it sounds louder to the ear, because the difference between the loudest point and the quietest point is reduced. And while done tastefully, that can have a positive impact on a track and increase the sound and in terms of the excitement levels of the track. And this is not to say that you shouldn't compress or limit your tracks at all, because it can be used for good. But when you push it too far, what starts to happen is eventually you get audible clipping. You eventually end up, if you push it, you keep going and going and going with that squashing process, you essentially start to square off the waves. You end up with a square wave if you push it far enough. And there are some really sort of obvious examples through history. I mean, in the UK, the Oasis album "What's the Story, Morning Glory" was one of the first to be a true kind of loudness war audio release. The Red Hot Chili Peppers' "Californication" was infamous for the fact that it was pushed and compressed to the point where even non-audiophile people could hear the distortion that started to creep in there. And then you've got, even worse than that, you've got albums like Metallica's Death Magnetic, which was another high-profile case whereby the audio was completely wrecked. So how does this relate back to remastered CDs? Well, I guess remastered CDs, the way that this process relates to why it's such a swindle is that I guess the record companies realized that they could take this same process, they could apply that same kind of zealous mastering bus compression, and then they could repackage those albums and sell those classic CDs as a supposedly improved remastered version of the CD. So on first listen, you might think, oh yeah, the louder version sounds better. But if you actually, volume match those, if you volume match the original release, let's take the example in the post. I think you were probably referring back to me talking to that vinyl versus CD in the loudness war post. Mm-hmm. There's a video in that post where somebody takes the original release of Dire Straits' "Money for Nothing" from 1985 and then puts it next to the remastered version from 2000, I think it was 2003, but anyway, in the new millennium, and then volume matches them and demonstrates how, and actually shows in the physical format, shows the physical wave on YouTube, showing all of that high frequency detail that's essentially been squashed and cut off. And when you volume match them like that, mm-hmm. You really hear that the loudness war overcompressed version of it sounds weak, feeble, and not as punchy and as exciting as the original master that had all the dynamics and all the high frequency transients maintained because it wasn't squashed. And so that's basically the core of it. So that's real proof that they're releasing classic albums and selling them as improved. And quite clearly from those kind of examples, they're really not. They're a subpar product, and that to me is one of the most cynical sort of phenomenons in the music industry over the past decade or so.
Right. So, like, say for instance, like I'm an XTC fan. So if I wanted to, like, I'll put on English Settlement and I'll listen to that record, and then let's say Burning Shed comes out with some remastered version of that album. Like, okay, I'm gonna get this, and it's gonna be like either a lossless download or it's gonna be a CD or whatever it is, and I'll put it on, and I can see or I can hear the differences in that remastered, version. And I mean, for an audiophile, if I'm purchasing that remastered version, what I'm hoping for is something that might be a little bit better or a little bit different. And there is that risk there that, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be, it's not going to have that same juice as I would get from the original version. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, this isn't necessarily true of all remastered CDs, but it's certainly, in my experience, true of a lot of them. And so, like you say, I don't think you kind of get there. There is that risk, and so there is ultimately you have to use your ears. I suppose is what it really comes down to. But I do believe it is quite cynical that kind of thing could be going on.
Yeah. And I think it was in that exact same article, and I took a peek at the dynamic range database that you link to. And
Sure.
How do you translate? I know this is off topic because it's a different website, but how do you translate what the results mean? I mean, I know what DR stands for. It's dynamic range. But what
Yeah.
about the 3 columns for DR, for minimum and maximum and stuff like that on that other website?
Yeah, they don't necessarily explain it particularly well, do they? It's a great resource, and I think it's one of the ways you can do some research and maybe decide as to whether or not you want to buy something that's remastered or not, and give it a go. And you can certainly get a good idea of the quality of mastering on a lot of different releases. So it's an unofficial database, and it's kind of crowdsourced in the way that they produce it. So anyone can submit to that database, and there's a tool you can download, and I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, to get to the core of your question, how do you decode what they're going on about there? I mean, yeah, dynamic range, so DR rating. They give everything a DR rating. And let me just pull up the database right now so that I can kind of use maybe some examples or something. But yeah, so they do a DR rating, and it ranges from 20 as a DR rating going up to which is deemed as incredibly dynamic, and then it goes up to 1, which is deemed as practically no dynamics at all, which is obviously bad. And they color code it from green to red respectively. So you mentioned the 3 different scores that they have. So they have the overall DR rating. That is the average dynamic range. So the average, the difference between the kind of the loudest point and the lowest point within the record across the entire album, or LP, 10-inch, single, whatever the actual product that's been uploaded to the database. That's the average level across that entire release. And this is how I understand it, is that the minimum and maximum side is that the minimum dynamic range, so the minimum rating that was discovered throughout that album, and then the maximum is the maximum throughout that album. So the maximum, the most dynamic point in the record was, and let's just have a look at this one that's come up here. Let's do a search. Let's do Rumours by Fleetwood Mac, and see some releases kind of there that I'll just kind of talk through. So
there's a new book that just came out about that album.
Oh yeah,
it's an excellent album, all the way from the songwriting to the recording to, you put that album on and it's like, wow.
Yeah, no, totally. I think it's probably one of the most, it's incredibly timeless as well. I think it dates incredibly well, and it's probably my favorite pop rock record. But yeah, I mean, cool. I've just searched that there. And there are several different versions of Rumours. As you know, it's obviously one of the biggest selling albums of all time. But let's take this kind of version from, trying to find a good example here. Well, anyway, the 35th anniversary edition. So here's an example of the Loudness War kind of in action. So the original release was incredibly dynamic, somewhere at least from sort of 12 or below in terms of rating. The 35th anniversary release is at 9, and although that's considered transition and not too bad actually for a remaster, it's still lower in dynamic range than the original. And the minimum rating on that is 8, so that's considered the beginning of bad. So at the kind of least dynamic point in the album, the score was 8, and then the maximum here is 13. So the most dynamic point of the record, the quietest point of the record, is 13. So that kind of gives you an idea, and it's worth maybe I don't know, maybe in your show notes I'll drop some links to things like that as a resource, and maybe a couple of my posts just to show some examples.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be excellent. I'd like that.
Sure.
And then I wanted to speak about your own music for a little bit. When I was listening to your SoundCloud, I really liked the song Control. And I wanted to ask, do you record and mix all your own music?
Well, thank you very much for your kind words, first and foremost. That's all mixed and done by myself. In fact, I played pretty much everything on on that record. I did have some when I was living in Canada. I was fortunate enough to have quite a nice little home studio set up, and I did flirt with the idea of playing the drums for a while. I guess I really wanted to record music as organically as possible. I started from quite a young age, sort of 17, even as young as 16, to be honest with you, in the most crudest fashion. I think my first recording was literally done on Windows, like media player recorder, and so I used my computer multimedia microphone, and I recorded all the audio jack input, I think, on a really awful built-in sound card, and I recorded layer by layer, and then I kind of took them somehow, and it was so long ago. I guess I took those separate tracks. I played kind of lead guitar bits over the top of a rhythm piece, and then pieced them and layered them together, because I didn't have multi-track recording software. I didn't have Logic or anything like that at the point. So I literally then time synced them after I'd recorded them. So it was a really laborious process, but that was my first experience of recording. But anyway, through that, I kind of learned to use a proper DAW. I started with Cubase and all those kind of packages, and then later, nowadays, I tend to prefer Logic. But anyway, to kind of cut to the chase, I always had to do that kind of myself. I mean, I had played in bands and everything, and there is some pretty dodgy music going around from back in my band days as well, which I will not go into. But at the same time, I was recording sort of music myself, and still writing songs and recording them myself. And I was just doing it in my bedroom as a teenager at the time. But I always aspired to doing things kind of naturally and acoustically, and having real drums on something. I was just something I just desired to do. So I did that on this album, and to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not sure I would do that again. I think you can, and I think I'm probably guilty of this, is taking on too much when you're recording your own music, and you try and do everything yourself. You do the vocals, you do the guitar, you do the songwriting, you go right down to playing extreme cases like I did, is playing the drums yourself as well, and then you go mix it, and then you go master it. You don't have that kind of camaraderie and the playing off of with other people and other people's ideas and other people's opinions to kind of tell you when something's really good or when something's not so good. And you also ultimately, people when they come together, I think, are ultimately more creative in the long run. So even if it's just somebody mixing and mastering your own music, or at least somebody helping you with that process, I think it's healthy to have somebody else in the process somewhere. So I'm not sure I would go down that route again of being so self-contained. It was a great process. I certainly learned a lot. It was all done in Logic in my home studio, with just nothing particularly fancy, but it was a fairly decent setup for a home setup. The acoustics were somewhat controlled with just some basic acoustic foam. Otherwise, I would never have been able to record drums in such a crude space.
Like air, it's everywhere. Are we in control? like an ocean. Always in motion.
And yeah, I mean, I guess I won't bore you with the details, but it was all just done entirely from scratch and then mixed and then mastered myself. The mastering process, I must admit, is probably the one that I think if I had the budget and the money, I would love to have been able to pay somebody else to do, because I really do believe it's a specialist skill.
Yeah.
I think learning to mix and record your own music is one thing, but I think mastering really requires a really good set of ears, B, a lot of experience, C, some really great equipment, and D, a very well tuned room to actually get the best results and get truly professional results. So that's not something I would do again. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, when you're when you're a poor musician, you work with what you got, right?
That's right. Yeah, you do. Definitely. I agree that your music does have more of that raw element. It's like being in a room with you playing. So it definitely comes across that way. It isn't overprocessed and overproduced. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I take that as I guess somewhat of a compliment. I mean, I love music from this. My real passion, music wise, I guess. I grew up with sort of my parents' 60s and 70s kind of rock based stuff, and I've always loved the organic kind of dry sound. I mean,
Yeah.
we talked about, you mentioned, obviously the story behind Rumors and how fantastic and timeless that album is. I love the dryness. I particularly love the dryness of the drums, and I just love that recording. I think it's to me it's like the craft of pop music in album form kind of personified. It's a really timeless piece, and I think and don't get me wrong, I love electronic music as well. I love a diverse range of music, and I'm very open minded when it comes to what I listen to. But when it comes to writing my own stuff, I guess I really love that kind of sound, and I ultimately feel almost because it when you strip away kind of extreme production techniques and everything, in some ways it can stand the test of time better or more easily, because it's not confined to the sound and the production methods of that particular decade. I mean, I think the 80s is probably the worst example of that, where every single snare drum had gated reverb on it, and and you really know an 80s sound when you hear it, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I opted for the more organic sound because for those kind of reasons, really. But yeah, thank you for having a listen.
Yeah, it's definitely a compliment. So, so you have what it looked like was 3 albums up on your SoundCloud. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the earlier ones, the first one, which is called Reasons For, and this all, I'll just reveal my age so you can get the idea of how old some of these recordings are. I'm 30 years old, so that album was recorded when I was 17, so it's or 17, 18, so it's very old now, and that was really the beginning. That was really the beginnings of me actually recording music properly. As I say, when I was very, very young, I did it all very rudimentary on very basic equipment. But yeah, there was that album. I've only got a few select songs on my SoundCloud for that album. I then did an album a couple of years later called Tranquil Silence, which again I think was maybe a slight improvement in my production skills, but was still done on very, very, very basic equipment. I mean, I didn't have a penny to scrape together, so it was, and there were certainly things I would, I listen back and it's terrible, isn't it? You listen to your own music and you hear everything that you would have done differently, and your own worst critic, I suppose. So I find it difficult to almost listen to my own stuff, if I'm perfectly honest with you. But then, yeah, I mean, I did a whole bunch of other experimental projects, which I'm less proud of. And then it finally kind of got to that more recent one, but even that one that has the track Control on, which is called Departures, even that is now a good 5 years old. So I guess having a full-time job, working for a major manufacturer of microphones, kind of takes its toll and takes your time up. So I've done a few bits. I still do pieces here and there where I can fit it in, but I haven't sat down and done a whole album since then, unfortunately. And I really miss it. And I hope one day if I can get more time on my hands, I can rekindle that passion. But yeah, thanks again for your kind words.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, besides the full-time job, you're also running this website. So that seems like another good chunk of time right there.
Yeah, I have my fingers in a lot of pies with online stuff. I do the SoundMatters stuff, but I also have a couple of I have a startup I'm trying to create with a friend of mine from Canada, actually, which is non-music related, so I won't go into it. But ultimately, I think I'd like to get to a position where if I was working for myself in some capacity, I would ultimately have more time to pursue music, because that's ultimately where my heart lies. So I guess that's what it's all about at the end of the day, is having the time to pursue those passions.
Yep. And there is a tab on your website called Sound as Medicine. Is that another project that you're working on?
Yeah, that's somewhat of an experimental thing. I guess I'll keep this one brief because it's in its early infancy at the moment. So the whole sound as medicine thing caught my attention partly because sort of working in a kind of corporate environment. You work in a lot of busy sort of open office environments, and I became increasingly aware as somebody who, I guess a lot of musicians might be able to relate to this, as somebody who thinks in an audible kind of way, if that makes sense. You're very naturally aware. I mean, you probably find this yourself, Clara, as well, that you hear things differently than some other people do. You might be aware of sounds and music and background stuff going on that other people may be it's just subconscious and it just goes on and they don't necessarily become aware of it. But I've become increasingly aware of how some of those environments, like open offices, for example, can have a huge detrimental effect on our concentration. And I think, as I've demonstrated and talked about through the kind of vinyl stuff that we talked about and how music truly has the ability to, be inspiring and have an effect on people. Again, just in the same way, the sounds around us have that same ability to have a psychological impact on our lives. And I just found that I find it very difficult to concentrate in those kind of environments. And I found that sound can be used as part of the solution to counteract that. So, I mean, that doesn't just go for open offices. That goes for relaxation. It goes for being able to switch off and go to sleep. It goes down to those kind of psychological levels, and that's a topic that really interests me, and it's something that I'm just in the early stages of right now, of kind of exploring as to how we can use sound to improve our lives. We can use it to improve our lives by reducing stress and getting to the point. Really, I think sound is incredibly powerful, and I really want to explore the power of that. And so this is just another outlet for me to geek out.
Yeah. I geeked out a few years ago, and it was about 5 or 6 years ago. I became a member of a project that was, I can't remember the name of it now, but it was basically a group of people from around the world trying to preserve natural soundscapes. And a couple of the people were sound ecologists or soundscape ecologists. And basically there's this little known battle with noise pollution, air traffic, road traffic, factory noise, just any type of, human noise. And basically all of these little noises, we can't see them, and sometimes, as you're saying, they're in the background, they're subconscious, but noise impacts our natural resources. It impacts how different organisms relate to each other, and different vibrations, and all of those little things, they interfere with bird song, they interfere with fish and bugs, and all kinds of things, and people don't really realize how important natural soundscapes are. And I bring this up because on your blog, when you're talking about sound as medicine, and you're talking about listening to natural sounds, and those recordings of natural sounds are really hard to get. They're really difficult to get because all of our natural soundscapes are disappearing. So you might be out in the field trying to record a stream, and a Jeep goes by on the dirt road, or a plane goes by overhead, and you're recording a shot. So, there's this... I need to find out more about that, and so maybe I can contribute, or maybe there are some soundscape ecologists that can work with some of the information that you might be coming across with your project. So,
yeah, that's really fascinating, and I think you're quite right. It's like the slow creep of noise pollution, and that has repercussions for us as a human race. And that's a fascinating topic. Yeah, we should perhaps a topic for another day. But yeah, we should talk more about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Cool.
Marc, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today, and I have a couple more questions for you. What would you say to someone to try to encourage them to listen to vinyl?
Okay. Interesting question. I guess I would I would never try and enforce any right or wrong way to kind of one format being the right format to listen to. I mean, I would encourage certain habits, as I guess I've talked about, with trying to get the most out of music by not just listening to music on tinny laptop speakers and things like that, because I feel people are missing out. But what I would do is I would talk about the things I love about vinyl. So I would talk about the fact that if somebody was thinking of getting into the hobby, I would talk about the kind of the ritual, the process, the kind of the warmth of the sound. And I know that's a real cliche, but essentially when people talk about the warmth of vinyl, they're actually talking about the inherent limitations of vinyl that cause little bits of distortion that we perceive as kind of warmth. And I guess as musicians, we're kind of drawn to analog things, and it's a little bit like tube-based guitar amps. We're kind of drawn to that kind of that warmth and that kind of organicness of sound. And I guess I would try and highlight those kind of things. It's like as perfect as digital can be. Sometimes for me, there's that little element of magic missing, and so I would encourage people to go and have a listen, kind of allow the music and physical format in that state to demand their attention. And I really do think vinyl does demand people's attention, and I would encourage them to take a record, open the sleeve, enjoy the entire process of popping the record on, right through to flipping it over to get to the other side, reading the sleeve notes. And I would encourage them to just kind of let music consume them, because I think we're in the modern age, we're very guilty of multitasking almost too much. We have our mobile phones open on one hand, whilst we've got the TV on the other hand, and maybe we've got a laptop on at the same time, and it's that kind of that multi-screening thing. And ultimately, we never give 100% of our attention to anything when we're doing that. So I believe, I would say to get somebody to get into vinyl, I would say it's the best way to allow music to fully consume you, in my personal humble opinion. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. And then what would you say to sound engineers to encourage them to mix and master with more dynamics?
Yeah, interesting question. I think a lot of that really is driven by record companies and their perceived idea of what makes a competitive release. So my feeling is that, generally speaking, mastering engineers, if they were given more choice and there was no commercial kind of interest from record companies, that was, albeit nothing wrong with commercial interest and everything, everybody has to make money, but if there was that, if there wasn't that kind of misconception from the record companies that they need to do that, then I think ultimately mastering engineers would mix with more dynamics. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. I guess I should end on this, and I guess this is where hopefully the better judgment of mixing and mastering engineers is eventually going to win. I believe in the long haul, is that a lot of the incentive for record companies to actually do this now is slowly being removed. So you look at something like iTunes Radio a few years back, for example. In 2013, they introduced this function that actually levels out the volume differences on the radio between the different tracks. So say you've got one track that was mixed and mastered in the early 90s, and all of a sudden a much louder song comes on that was brickwalled at the turn of the millennium. Without that kind of volume leveling out, they would come up. One would come up extremely, or a heck of a lot more louder than the other one, and that's incredibly irritating for somebody trying to consume music across from one album to the next. So there are things creeping in with some of the streaming platforms as well, and everything, and some kind of volume standards being realized. It's well worth looking into what the well-known well-respected mixing engineer Bob Katz has to say about the topic. He's kind of claimed that it's going to go away because there's some standards coming in, and that things like volume equalization or levelization. So, it's literally just changing the volume. It's not imparting any sort of compression to change the volume, so it's literally just moving a fader automatically, if you like. So there's no degradation of the sound further beyond that point. So if all music on digital platforms is eventually going to be played back at the same volume anyway, then surely the incentive to loudness war your masters is going to look it's going to look less attractive to do that over time, hopefully.
Yeah.
So
it'll be a moot point.
Yeah, exactly, and I guess that kind of answers the question, but kind of goes off topic. But I think it's worth mentioning that, because I think there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that's good news for us music fans. And
I think especially with so many more people, just do-it-yourself artists mixing and mastering all of their own music, recording, and everyone's just doing it themselves. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people, I would say the majority of music out there is being made by the do-it-yourself artists, the underground mixing and mastering engineers. So, I definitely want to encourage that crowd of people to mix and master with more dynamics, and don't be afraid to be a little bit more quiet than some of the major releases that are out there, because in the long run those dynamics really help to get your emotions across. So you're totally right. I mean, ultimately, you own the volume control, not the record label. Right.
So, when you turn up a record with great dynamics, it sounds exciting and punchy and loud. You turn up something that's been loudness warred, and it doesn't have that same impact.
No.
And so I think you're right. I think, encouraging people to not be afraid of that is good. And, ultimately, there are standards being created. There are some broadcast standards slowly being more and more enforced, particularly in the States, actually, which again offers light at the end of the tunnel. And I would definitely encourage people to do a bit of research before you go and master your own stuff. It is possible to make loud, punchy tracks but maintain the excitement and the dynamics. It is possible to find that kind of middle ground, and depending on the kind of music that you're mastering, it calls for different approaches. So I guess don't always assume that just louder is always better.
Right. Wow. Thank you so much, Marc, for all of your information that you shared today. I really appreciate it, and I learned so much.
Well, thank you for having me on again, and hopefully there wasn't too much waffle in there, and hopefully as you say, I'm glad you picked some good points out of there, and hopefully people get something out of it.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Mm-hmm.